in the time scale that we're looking at. Even if you are a great fan of trading, it can't do the job in time. It may be able to do the job in principle. So what's the alternative? I think, firstly, the alternative is that we need to recognize that if what the climate scientists are telling us now about the higher than expected level of sensitivity about the climate system is true, then we have to think very differently about the problem. Now, you may want to still continue the science debate and say, I don't buy what the climate scientists are telling us. And I will readily agree with any of you who says, actually, sometimes, quite often, what we get from some of the scientists at least is closer to climate pornography than it is to science, as we are treated to very, very catastrophic scenarios for what might happen to climate change. But let's just say we'll go with the mainstream for the time being. If what they tell us is true, and what I've just said has any validity at all, climate change is not an optimizing problem. This is not a problem where we can do a benefit-cost analysis and see where the marginal cost of abating emissions intersects the marginal damage costs and say that's where we implement policies, which is what Nick Stern did in the celebrated Stern report. We need to move to a different way of thinking, and I would say that the way of thinking that we need to move to was exemplified by governments last year in the global financial crisis. Nobody did a benefit-cost analysis for nationalising Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, AIG in the United States, or nationalising the Northern Rock Bank in the United Kingdom. Governments saw that there was a present threat to human welfare. The corpse was on the floor bleeding. They said, we've got to stop that blood flow. So it was strategic thinking. If indeed strategic thinking is required, let's push that parallel a bit further. I said we needed public investment, or we needed to accelerate the investment, rather, in the RDD&D, which is this top curve. And I would argue that has to come ultimately from public investment on a massive scale. What should the scale be? I don't honestly know. But my thinking about this was to think, what do governments currently spend on military R&D? That's a strategic problem, right? Defense. So let's push that parallel a little further. And although it's difficult to unravel the American budgetary process, what the US currently spends on military R&D, not military expenditure, just R&D, is about $80 billion a year. The UK spends about £4 billion a year. I'm afraid I don't know the figures for Italy. But if you look at any of the climate policy documents that governments are producing, whether it's for 2020 in Europe, whether it's for the UK Climate Change Act, nowhere near those levels of expenditure are being envisaged to bring about the kind of technological transformation that would really get us away from our current carbon-intensive trajectory. So I'm arguing here for public investment. I work in a business school. I was in the US shortly after the oil crises of the 1970s, and I know that actually asking government bureaucrats and politicians to pick winners is a very bad idea. This is what happened in the 70s in the US in the wake of the oil price shocks. The investment went to the congressional districts of powerful congressmen and to the particular technologies that DOE bureaucrats had studied in engineering school. You don't want that to happen. So we have to be ingenious, and perhaps my colleague, the rector, would be enthusiastic about marshalling the wisdom of the financial economists to think about how to design a kind of policy instrument, perhaps modelled more on mutual funds and portfolios of shares, of portfolios of technology, with a minimum level of variety in them that can then compete against each other to carry this forward, so you don't end up having just investment in nuclear or just investment in solar or just investment in wind, but you actually bring a number of these technologies along, not knowing which one the market's going to pick. And then you let the market do the bit that it knows does better than anyone else, which is to pick from a set of well-defined alternatives. There's also another problem, which I don't think anybody I'm aware of has thought about, which is the problem of getting dirty technologies out of the bottom. It's usually assumed that you put the clean technology in on top and the dirty ones disappear. It displaces the dirty technologies. Actually, it doesn't. Those dirty technologies just go to poor people. So actually today we use as much biomass energy globally as we did 100 years ago. We burn as much wood and cow dung as we did 100 years ago. Actually, here's a little bit of trivia for you. Humankind has only ever given up one energy source. Does anybody know what it is? Sperm whale oil. And it wasn't because we was running out of sperm whales. It was because kerosene was a lot cheaper and very easily substitutable. So this is actually why the idea of cash for clunkers is a good one. It is a way of getting the dirty technologies out of the bottom of the market. And we need to think about how we extend those kinds of policy initiatives. But of course, controlling emissions is only one element of a comprehensive climate policy. We're already committed, as I said, to a considerable level of climate change, and we're going to need to do much more in the way of climate adaptation. Now, for many years, talking about climate adaptation to environmentalists was a bit like talking to American Southern Baptists about sex education in schools. It was considered a bad idea. You were encouraging people to think that they can carry on with their bad behaviour because there's some other way to fix it. This is what insurers call a moral hazard. Fortunately, that view has now lifted, but it took about 20 years to get that view, to push that view back. And as a result of that, we have a lot more people exposed to higher potential damage than we would have done otherwise. But the extent of resources we're currently putting into adaptation is just a tiny fraction of even the inadequate resources we're currently putting into mitigation technology. And let me say I'm talking here about the need to adapt to climate, not just climate change. New Orleans was not well adapted to the existing climate. In many places, people are vulnerable because they're vulnerable to climate conditions, regardless of climate change. And climate change adaptation funds internationally only pay for the human-induced increment between people's current exposure and their potential future exposure. So if I need a 3-meter-high seawall to protect my population in Bangladesh, I can only pay for the I can only get international funding for the 15 additional centimetres that may come from sea level rise, not for the 3 meters I need in the first place. Let me also point out here that the very large increases in financial damage from hurricanes in Florida this century has entirely arisen from increasingly putting very expensive infrastructure in silly places like luxury hotels right on the seafront. That's why damage costs have gone up. It's not actually because of increasing hurricane intensity. So there's a lot of adaptation to climate, which makes perfect sense because it's actually providing human welfare to people regardless of what you think about climate change. I'm just going to come to a close now because I see I'm overrunning by a few minutes. Because I do want to just introduce a third element, which is going beyond mitigating emissions, going beyond adaptation, which is actually thinking about remediating the climate. And this is the area which is currently beginning to receive some attention, that of climate change geoengineering. The idea here is to intervene in Earth systems to either take carbon out of the atmosphere or to reflect sunlight to reduce the heating. So you can have atmospheric carbon removal or increase the radiative capacity of the Earth. Then there are two ways you can achieve these goals. One is by what I call here ecosystems tinkering. Some people prefer the term tuning. They think that sounds a bit more responsible than tinkering. And this would involve methods like putting